Good evening, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. So welcome to our second town hall of the year, and this time in Crow's Nest. A few housekeeping points before we actually begin. Please make sure you have turned off your mobile phones. Only the sound, because you can use the QR codes in front of you, scan that, and you can ask us some questions at the end. The exit, as you know, is over there, and the bathrooms are out there too. I would like to begin tonight by acknowledging the Camaragal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, and pay our respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge their spiritual connection to country. My name's Jill Bryant, and I'm Zali's Electorate Business Manager. And for those of you who don't know, the Electorate Office serves many purposes, but primarily we are here to support the community and to support Zali deliver in Canberra for the electorate. The Electoral Office's team focus is to ensure we deliver what the community needs across NDIS, aged care, Centrelink issues, visa issues, often supporting people through the worst of times, responding to over 3,300 cases this year alone. As you can imagine, Zali's inbox fills up every time you take your eyes off it. But it's these cases and these emails that enable the constituent liaison team to inform the parliamentary team, both of whom are here tonight, with what matters to this community, how you feel about key issues. And in turn, this ensures Zali can reflect the views of Warringah when in Canberra. And tonight, Zali's going to give an overview about the many ways that she has represented you in Canberra this term, continually reviewing proposed legislation through the eyes of the constituency. She's proposed amendments, asked questions in the House, presented private members' bills on issues you've said matter, and met with ministers to raise direct issues. So let's hear about that work now. Please welcome our federal member for Warringah, Zali Steggall.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming out, and thank you. I'll just do a special mention to all the families from Kelly's Place. I know the little ones needed to go home, which I totally understand, but thank you for coming out, so many of you, because it really is important. It's the only way it's one of the many ways we touch base with the community and make sure that I am representing your views on the issues that are coming up. I'll start by also acknowledging the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, and recognising that really important custodianship and the journey we're on in truth-telling and ensuring we do get to a better place of reconciliation. One of the joys I get as a Member of Parliament is to attend citizenship ceremonies, and it is always so exciting to watch people within our community who have often been in Australia the shortest is about 5 years. The longest I've had has been a lady who was here for 73 years, who finally Germany was allowing the dual citizenship, and so was finally taking that step of being an Australian citizen. And she was so excited. She was in tears at the prospect of it, having worked, raised her family, paid her taxes, contributed so much to Australia, but not having had that voice and opportunity to vote on decisions. And so for her, it was so meaningful. But so attending those citizenship ceremonies is really important, because for me, it's that real reminder of what an incredibly multicultural, multi-faith society Australia has, our rich diversity, and how much our communities and our diverse communities are in fact the engine, the absolute power engine of Australia. And it's always exciting to see that commitment of so many who have come to Australia in many different ways, whether it's been through coming to Australia, from work or study or an opportunity, or because they've seeking safety for their family, for their loved ones from a country where they might be persecuted and they don't have rights. And they are always so committed to Australia. So I want to acknowledge that part of our community. Now, many of you have submitted questions, key concerns, and many are on that list. So housing affordability and supply is a very present one. as cost of living and inflation and issues at the moment. Childcare and local services, acknowledging Kelly's place, and I'll get to that a little bit more. Local transport and congestion. Obviously, the more internationally, some of these issues are state-based, which I take on the responsibility of being a spokesperson for. I don't directly always have the ability to change the outcomes, but I certainly do engage with state ministers as well to try and represent the views of the community and push, especially when there's partnership funding with federal government as well, and there's that capacity to put pressure and pull the levers both ways. Of course, there's international issues very much dominating the landscape at the moment with the conflicts in the Middle East. And then there's other rumours and a real state of flux in Australian politics with the rise of One Nation and what that may mean for I think our unity as a country, but also what does that mean for us into the future. So I'll address some of that, but I guess I'll give you a bit of an overview. Some of you may be signed on to the newsletter and see regularly what happens in Canberra, but for those who aren't, I guess I wanted to give you a bit of an update. So over the last 12 months, it's hard to imagine it's already 12 months since the last election, but it has been busy. It feels like a long time ago. Some of the key bills that we've had from the government, especially the more recent ones, I think that are contentious, is the NDIS amendment bill around securing the NDIS for future generations, Bill 2026. I've got to be frank, I'm not happy with that bill, and I've had a lot of feedback from the community on that and how it's going to impact people who are participants that use the NDIS and also providers, and how they're going to be impacted. I've moved amendments allowing participants to seek plan reassessment more easily, to tighten the minister's ability to reduce support funding, and ensuring a merits review is undertaken if the plan is cut substantially. As it currently stands, that legislation I don't think is acceptable because it substantially cuts NDIS provision. It takes about 160,000 families off the NDIS without having in place the replacement services that are anticipated for children around Thriving Kids, which will be delivered by state governments, and they're not all in place yet. There's also really broad discretionary powers for the minister of that legislation that with many of my colleagues we're really unhappy with how that looks, and we need much more certainty. I know there's been a narrative of fraud and abuse in the NDIS. There is an element of fraud, but it's I think an unfair excuse that is there's been a real a concerted effort to push the narrative of fraud to justify the cuts when there is also fraud under Medicare and in other areas, and we don't have that same narrative. The reality is you can deal with a lot of that fraud through administrative changes without actually impacting the participants or ensuring there's that continuity of care. The next most contentious one would be the most recent government tax reform legislation following the budget, with significant changes when it comes to capital gains and tax settings and negative gearing. Now, in relation to those two bills, I'll get to that one in a lot more detail in a minute because there's obviously a lot to be said around what's been proposed and the government's change of position. Those two bills, though, haven't yet passed. We've had the second reading debate in the House of Reps. It's been adjourned so far. We have pressed a lot of amendments in relation to the legislations, but they are now stalled in the Senate essentially, where there is negotiations and push for there to be greater inquiry about the implications of those two pieces of legislation. Some of the good news pieces for maybe young people in the room: the Universities Accord legislation cutting student debt by 20% went through, but again, that's a half. It's a bit of the theme of this government is it only does things by half measures. Whilst that cutting of debt was really important, it still hasn't fixed the date of indexation. So what happened on the 1st of June was the indexation of a student debt occurred prior to any compulsory payments that have been made over the last 12 months being applied to that debt. So imagine if your mortgages, your interest rates went up and your overall went up with that interest rate, but all the payments you'd made over the last 12 months weren't applied to your debt. It's ludicrous. This would not be accepted in any other setting. The indexation date has to change, and my crossbench colleague has proposed for the indexation date to be made the 1st of November, because that would ensure people with a HECS debt could lodge their tax returns, have their compulsory payments applied to their debt, and then the remaining debt would be indexed to whatever the new debt would be. I think that would be a much fairer outcome. But again, it's going to take some work to push the government on that piece. Treasury Law Amendment, Strengthening Financial Systems and Other Measures Bill. It's an omnibus bill around scam, with a scam prevention framework. Scams are still really prevalent in the community, and we have we have booklets to be how to be mindful, but we still need much stronger legislation to protect people from scams. I was successful in getting an amendment with the government around reversing the onus in terms of a victim of a scam. You know, it's very hard to establish the fault of the telco or the platform or the bank in facilitating a scam from occurring. So putting the onus on them that they should first show that they have complied with their responsibility before a victim has to then show that they've been negligent or, you know, that haven't taken due care. Another piece of legislation has been the Australian Centre for Disease Control Bill. This is good. Everyone knows on the back of COVID we need better preparedness. A CDC is really important to do that. Freedom of Information Bill, that was a controversial one. In fact, the crossbench and the opposition, we all succeeded in getting the government to back down. So this was the government trying to reduce access from the public or the media or anyone to making a freedom of information request around decision making of government or sort of bodies. Late last year, the Environmental Protection Reform Bill went through to amend the EPBC Act. I was not happy with that. It still doesn't set a clear standards to really protect the environment and doesn't set a really good balance. And we still don't have what the national environmental standards are going to be. So it's I have met and discussed this with the Environmental Minister quite a few times, but there's a lot more work to be done there. A win last year was around Communications Legislation Amendment Bill, which was a content quota win. So we all love watching Australian stories on our screens. It's really important, especially for our young people as they grow up, that they hear and see Australian stories. And we now consume so much of our entertainment through platforms who all use our of course, our broadband network and the NBN. And so to make sure that we have minimum quotas for Australian content on those platforms to ensure that we have an ecosystem in Australia that still has support. If not, we'll just get American content and that will be it. The High Seas Biodiversity Bill was also passed, which ratifies and protects marine life in international waters beyond Australia's jurisdiction. This was something that we had signed up to the treaty, so it was really long-standing that we needed to ratify into legislation. As an island continent, I think incredibly important that we have a strong eye on how we're protecting the high seas and our oceans. Ironically, we don't have an oceans minister. We have a minister for the environment, water, but we don't have a minister for oceans, and the question being how much focus there is on our oceans around us as opposed to our river systems and, you know, big basins like the Murray-Darling Basin. It's an interesting one, and there is quite a push, and I'm actually a co-chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Oceans to try and push the government around a better focus on protecting our oceans. But okay, I think high on everyone's mind is cost of living and the budget from a couple of weeks ago. Thank you to everyone who might have read through the newsletter, and we tried to do a digest of the budget on that night, and thank you to my team who we worked till about midnight that night to try and get it up and out. There's a lot to dissect. So essentially only the crossbench attend the budget lockup with media. Most backbenchers of the political parties don't read budget papers, they don't even look at them because they just get told by the party room what's in them, and that's kind of it. With my team, we go into the budget lockup small resources, but we have a lot of reading to do to dissect it, to understand what it means for our community and try and give you an overview of that as quickly as possible. So my take was I welcome some of the measures of the budget, right? It's important, especially around the question of affordability of housing and property. I had already, before the last election, argued that we needed to wind back capital gains incentives in relation to property because it has distorted the pricing in the market. It's meant first home buyers are up against investors when it comes to property, and an investor can leverage across multiple properties and so has greater buying power. And it has seen this escalation of price, which homeowners have all benefited from that increased value, but it has meant that younger people in our community simply cannot afford to stay and live close to where they've grown up. And we have a huge affordability crisis. And so we do need to draw a line in the sand and try and reset the system. So I did welcome, it wasn't about face by the government, and we've all seen the Prime Minister had made many promises and he's changed his mind. I did welcome it when it came to property because I think it's sorely needed, and the supply levers alone are not working, right? We are on a course to build a lot of housing, but it simply is not going to deliver enough fast enough to bring the prices down to an affordability level. And we know that translates through to rental as well. We have one of the lowest rental availability and some of the most expensive rental in the country. So it is a huge problem. But look, unfortunately, I did feel the budget was too reactive in terms of short-term relief without the deeper reform that were needed around housing, productivity, climate resilience and intergenerational fairness. So there were some small offsets coming through from tax cuts and the $250 offset or the $1,000 offset from deductions, but I think it still left a lot to. There was a lot that hadn't been tackled. They didn't tackle greater revenue from resources, for example, better taxing of our gas resources. Now, I met with the Treasurer and I reminded him that I had actually argued with him a few years ago when they introduced the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax, PRT, that the government chose the weakest model possible that was recommended by Treasury instead of the strongest in terms of how much revenue it would bring back. And I pointed out to him that I had said already then that this was not going to be a model that delivered for the Australian people. And look, I would say watch this space. I think the pressure that's building from communities will put enough pressure on the government to move on this question. So we didn't see that revenue repair in the budget that could offset some of the other changes, right? The discussion I had with the Treasurer was, you're here asking me to do better funding for all these pieces, but the money's got to come from somewhere. And I said, well, yes, okay, well, let's have that discussion. Then we can start scaling back the diesel fuel excise that goes to mining. That's about $10 billion over 3 years. The revenue lost from gas, better PRT. These are all ways in which we can pay for the other things that are desperately needed. Of course, I got a lot of pushback, but that's okay. I will keep pushing for those changes. Negative gearing was wound back in the budget in relation to investors for buying existing homes and outbidding first buyers. Now, what's important to understand around the changes the government's proposed is that this is a line in the sand, that anyone that has at budget night had a property already negatively geared, that can continue, and it's not limited in time into the future. Others have proposed amendments, which I didn't support and didn't pass. So it's very much a line in the sand. Any benefits made to date can be banked, essentially. It's into the future that CGT and negative gearing will only be available for new builds. So the government is encouraging people who want to invest in property to help solve the supply problem by making it more attractive to invest into new builds rather than existing housing. I did have a meeting with Claire O'Neill and the Treasurer around the question of how much you anticipate this will impact housing prices, and it's very hard for them to model it, but they are fairly positive around and it's more than hopeful, but they anticipate it will move fairly quickly and well. So I do welcome that because, as I said, I think that's so important. But this kind of reform design really matters, and bringing the community with you really matters. And I think, like many of you, we were all quite blindsided that the government decided to expand this to business, to shares, to trusts, to ETFs. There hadn't been any discussion of that. I think there was a broad discussion around housing affordability and what levers needed to be pulled. There had not been that broader debate and lever around extending it. The government's been in consultation with COSBOA, which is the Council of Small Businesses Australia, with the Tech Council around what carve-outs they're going to do, where they're going to put the threshold. But I'm quite critical of that approach because it's left a lot of people questioning, not knowing where the line's going to be, how many businesses are going to be impacted. So, for example, the definition of a small business, there is an exemption for small business, but the current definition of a small business the government is applying is a turnover of 2 million, but assets of 6 million. The ATO definition of a small business is turnover of 6 million with assets of 10 million. So very different. And COSBO are pushing the government towards that definition. Under the government's proposal, around 250 to 300,000 businesses will be caught by the CGT changes in terms of the value of business if it was sold. The argument is that can be dramatically reduced if you change the definition of small business. And we have to remember, from a productivity point of view, it's really important for people to start businesses, to employ people, to get into that entrepreneurship. And we don't want to stifle that with tax settings that make it really discourage. And I think it's really important to remember small businesses require, small to medium business, any kind of enterprise requires often years of sacrifice, years of no drawing an income, right? That you're investing everything back into the business, and it's in the hope that after a few years you've built something that maybe can be sold or passed on, and then there is a gain that is made. So what the government is proposing is that will now be taxed at a minimum 30% capital gains rate, index, so with index and applying it throughout. It's fairly complicated. Most people are confused, and we've been arguing with the Treasurer that this is not a model the government should be pushing. That's why it's being referred to. There is a strong push from the government needs the coalition to pass it through the Senate or the Greens. They are currently, we think doing a deal around the Greens want an inquiry into the NDIS changes and the Coalition wants an inquiry into the tax setting changes. If they make an agreement, then everything gets put into inquiry and we can have a bit more time to assess the consequences of all these changes. I would welcome that. These are big reforms that impact people's lives and businesses. You've made decisions legitimately under these settings. You're entitled to have more opportunity to understand and appreciate these changes. Part of other things that were missing in the budget, which I know is important to our community, is investment in climate resilience. We know insurance premiums are one of the highest inflationary item in your household budgets and we know a huge amount of Australians are underinsured or uninsured, and so you can spend your whole life building your biggest asset being your home or your contents, not be insured and then be at risk of losing everything. I think it's reckless, and it's a tragedy that the government is not focusing on this. To give you an idea of scale, disasters are costing around $40 billion a year already, and that's anticipated to grow to about $73 billion by 2060, which is about 4% of GDP. So I've been pushing the Treasurer and the government around a minimum investment of 0.25% of GDP to start building resilience, to create a fund to help local governments do the things that we know they could do to help the community. At the moment, we are all left paying. So constituents are having to pay through rates to councils for disaster relief, for emergency cleanups, for SES and those kind of things. So it's really unacceptable, and it was one of the points I raised in my meeting with the Treasurer, that they are still very myopic around their approach to safety and security. There's a big spend on defence, big spend on military, of course, we know AUKUS and everything else, but just nothing on actually domestic safety, right, when it comes to our safety at home from events that we know are happening, increasing in frequency and in severity. Last year we saw the government implement the first national risk assessment which is good. It's the first one. But there's been no proper plan or response to it, which is not good enough. So I'll keep hassling the Treasurer and the government around, I think, better economic management and better planning for some of our big challenges we have. If anyone hasn't signed up already, there's a great campaign around pushing for greater, the 25% gas export tax. We pay more in, revenue through HEX or through beer excise than what the gas companies do through the very big profits they make on gas exports. And ultimately, we have to remember these are Australian resources. They're finite resource. They aren't going to last forever, and we should be benefiting more from that resource. In terms of the CGT, what I wanted to raise as well is the concern around it extending to the shares and ETFs, for example, is I've had many young professional couples in their mid-30s who felt they've done everything right. They've gone to uni, they've got good careers, they're working hard, and they are barely making ends meet. They might be renting or they might have had an opportunity to buy. But for many, using shares and ETFs has been how they've been trying to build up an economic buffer. With whatever savings are left after they've paid tax on their wage, they're trying to make a buffer. And that's the argument that I've put to the Treasurer, I put through amendments of trying to encourage the government to think that the extension of the CGT changes to these classes of assets is problematic, because this was one of the small areas people were using to try and build that economic buffer. So I'll keep on advocating, and my feedback from the community has overwhelmingly been in this vein, that there is strong support for the property changes. People see the merit of that, but strong concern around the extension of the changes to business trusts, what it will mean for innovation, startups, and then when it comes to shares and ETFs, that we don't want to quash entrepreneurship and innovation and people starting businesses. We want to get that productivity moving. Mondays of sitting weeks, whoever's watching Parliament, is private members' business in the Monday mornings. We have a roster as a crossbench. We sort of get allocated terms of when it's our turn to do things. I've moved several private members' bill. I've moved a motion, and we get to ask questions and do lots of things. In fact, I've introduced two private members' bill, the Electoral Communications Bill, which is about the truth in political advertising. I think it's incredibly vexing that we still have a situation where we have consumer law protections where you can't lie to a consumer about what a product will do or a service will do, but a political agent can just openly lie in their communication. I find it incredibly vexing that we're saying we protect our consumer rights in a way differently to our voting rights. And I think the two are as valuable, right? If anything, I think our voting rights are more valuable because so much flows from those decisions. So I've met with Minister Don Farrell. I've advocated for it. The frustration is it actually is Labor Party policy to have truth in political advertising, but they are not in a hurry to close that loophole. I'll leave it for you to think about maybe why. But with the rise of One Nation, the rise of misinformation, we know so much is spread through social media platforms. I think it's really important. I'm going to reintroduce it with at least a request for watermarking of deepfakes and AI-generated content, so that at least we have a situation where a viewer can decide for themselves if they're looking at content, that if it's at least watermarked to say this is AI-generated, you can determine for yourself whether you accept it at face value or not, because it's it's very sophisticated. It has progressed so much so quickly that content is very hard to discern. So, the comedic sort of satirical stuff might be easy to detect. Other stuff is much harder to detect. I've also been pushing around that question of adaptation, so pushing for the government to legislate that we have regular national risk assessments and adaptation planning, and to legislate it so that come budget time, government has to respond to the risk. At the moment, I feel like we've got an army amassing on our border, but we have no defence white paper, we have no plan, and the government's saying she'll be right, community will take care of it, the volunteers will take care of it on the day, right? It's just not acceptable. We know we need to do so much more, and we have capacity to do it. That's the frustrating part. And economically, it's so important. So we know for every $1 we invest in prevention and resilience building, we save $10 in recovery costs. So it really makes a difference. But of course, for the government of today, they may not, it's not on their balance sheet, right? It's might be in the future. So they are less motivated to do that forward preventative piece. But I will keep pushing for that, because when I talk with the Insurance Council of Australia, for example, they know that they are pleading with the government to help reduce risk, because we can't insure our way out of the climate crisis. So insurers are just not going to insure certain areas of Australia. Just people will be exposed. So there's a lot more work to be done, and I'm committed. It was one of the key issues why I got into politics in the first place, so I remain very focused on that issue. But there was nothing in the budget for it, which was very disappointing. Look, there's obviously the range of things is broad that occur. We've tried with members of the crossbench to improve the conduct in Parliament. Anyone who's had children in year 5 or 6 attend, I'm always horrified at what they witness. The debate is not good at all. But trying to even introduce what is minimum, which is in any other workplace, that we have currently in the chamber, because of parliamentary privilege and that freedom of what occurs in the chamber, we don't have the usual worker protection. So we don't actually have a behaviour that is intimidating, harassing or bullying, specifically referred to as conduct that would give rise to disorderly conduct and would warrant expulsion from the chamber, which I find quite extraordinary. From a workplace point of view, that we don't have that. I moved amendments for that. There is an inquiry on foot, and I hope that comes, because what happens is you do have that disorderly conduct, and you have got intimidating and bullying behaviour. You have a mob-like mentality that devolves. And what I really worry about is, I'm a big girl, I can cope with it, but what I worry about is the behaviour this models for other people, for our kids, for other businesses and other environments. If it's seen to be acceptable in the Parliament of Australia, then how do you draw the line in any other workplace and really change the tone of what needs to happen? We've had lots of legislation. I'll probably refer you to go back maybe to the website, because Home Affairs legislation bill, Treasury laws, again, another piece of the budget was making it permanent that small businesses have an instant asset write-off each year rather than having a debate each year. That's been a frustrating piece we've been pushing the government on. It's $20,000. We've argued it should be $30,000 to $50,000 for it to meaningfully help businesses, but still important. I'm pushing for a duty of care in our environmental protection laws, because I find it extraordinary that a government of today doesn't owe a duty of care to future generations in the decisions they make, in how you balance out business and development and then the environment. It's this sense that the environment can be made up or caught up at a later time. We all know that's not the reality. Australia has one of the greatest losses of biodiversity loss, rate of biodiversity loss, and we're not yet really stopping it. For all the big comments Labor made in opposition, they haven't really arrested it or changed it much. We also don't yet have a plastics plan. There's a lot of areas where we've sort of been trying to press the government on all the areas that they really have not worked much. And we're not talking about a new government anymore. It's a second year into a second term, right? I think we're entitled to have a lot of expectation on all the things that haven't been done. Okay, I'm just trying to work my way through. Of course, late last year was horrendous for Australian communities with the terrorist attack in Bondi. And I've heard from many people in the community around the impact of that. And for me, I think it's, it's really important to call out anti-Semitism and all forms of religious hatred and discrimination. And so in January, Parliament was recalled to deal with broadening the definition of a hate crime, the gun law changes, and I supported those legislation with consultation with the community, because I felt really important that we have to do more to protect Australia and our community, but in particular our Jewish community, because they felt incredibly unsafe. I'm just going to push through. More amendments. Question time. Look, who's watched Question Time? Look, if I've got a question allocated, I'm paying a lot of attention. I've developed the skill to have two paces where I'm listening to the debate. I'm ready to do a point of order if I think things get out of hand. We do liaise with the speaker a little bit around, when things are happening and if I'm concerned about conduct. Because there's been horrendous, someone, Barnaby Joyce is sitting now on the crossbench and sometimes behaves appallingly, and others, and so you really want to call it out. But some of the questions I've asked about plastic pollution, gambling, calling for a Royal Commission into domestic violence. I don't accept the Prime Minister's position that he's said it is an issue that is a crisis. If there was any other situation with one Australian being killed a week, we would have much greater level of urgency. The government's position is, look, we're acting on the recommendations and we're working on it. We don't want a Royal Commission that would disrupt things. I don't accept that. It's a really fragmented space with actions taken by federal, state and, across the board. A Royal Commission elevates the issue, creates a real sense of accountability on all levels of government about if what they're doing is actually working. My concern is at the moment the level of funding for crisis accommodation, for legal aid, they all got cut in the budget. And they are core frontline services. So legal aid got cut, crisis accommodation got a little bit more, but not nearly as much as what was needed. And they are the front line of keeping Australians safe in this crisis. And then so much more needs to be done when it comes to respect and consent. We have I've asked questions around local issues, in particular the proposed divestment of the defence land in Warringah around HMAS Penguin. I don't know how much the community up here in Crow's Nest is aware, but obviously very important for that part of the electorate. And I think actually important for all of Australia, because these are really important assets that Defence holds on trust for the Australian people. Right? These are incredible headlands, incredible locations that were identified as key to Australia's defence. And Sydney, as the biggest city, I think an area like HMS Penguin is incredibly important. And I don't think it's good enough that the government has just, with Defence, done an audit of all its Defence estate and just determined that some areas can be divested or partially divested. Now, granted, there are some areas in regional areas or other that are unused or they're no longer, in active use and can be divested, and the local community is in support. That's fine. And those lands can be repurposed for housing and other things. But HMS Penguin is very much active, has capabilities that have been identified as critical. The Navy diving and the marine medical services have been there. And then has incredibly rich and vulnerable bushland, the Angostura forest, and that needs to be conserved. So there is a question around if that is divested, that should be put into conservation so that is protected, and that can either go to New South Wales National Parks or the Sydney Harbour Trust, but that should absolutely not be developed or sold off. And the red flag was when the Minister said to me, ultimately the goal is to get, a best commercial outcome for Defence. I thought that was a bit of a red flag. So I have been pressing the Prime Minister, the Minister for Defence and the government around this question, and also the Minister for Finance, Katie Gallagher, because it will be transferred to Finance from Defence if the divestment occurs. I've issued freedom of information requests around the question of they allegedly did a cost-benefit analysis of relocating some of the other services at HMS Penguin. And there's a real strong question around, well, what is the cost-benefit analysis between the current buildings continuing to be used for that purpose versus being moved to somewhere else, which clearly involved another cost, and what impact has been assessed. So I've asked for, under freedom of information, I've requested the cost-benefit assessment, the environmental impact, the cultural impact, the heritage impact of the area, so we can understand just how in-depth was the review by Defence Estate when they determined their decision for a partial divestment. There wasn't any community consultation prior to that decision. They're now doing it, but it's a little bit, one can be a bit cynical about that, doing it after the decision. But there's a lot of momentum. A lot of people in the community fighting against it, and a lot of pressure, and it's I've certainly put it top of mind on the Prime Minister's agenda that we're not happy with the decision and we want a good outcome in relation to HMS Penguin. And I've also asked about tax and gas exports and gambling ads. Now that's another area that's been really disappointing by the government. There's overwhelming consensus in the community for banning gambling advertising. The harm that is caused is immeasurable. Now, we're not talking about banning gambling. People are adults. If they want to gamble, that is their choice. But the gambling advertising is predatory. It is incessant, it targets people, it drafts even people that can put themselves on exclusion registers, it still comes after them. It's a constant, you can't watch sport without being harassed by gambling advertising. But unfortunately the government has caved at the moment with their proposal. They are still not willing to ban inducements or inducements in advertising. They're not willing to do a complete advertising ban. And all the experts in this space say that the government's proposal will not have a meaningful impact on reducing the problem of gambling. It will leave people exposed because it's requiring people to actively change their default settings on their phone. So the default position is you're going to see all the advertising unless you choose to exclude yourself. And it really should be the opposite. It should be that if you want to see it, you can call for it. But if not, it shouldn't be in everybody's feeds. It shouldn't be on every screen. It shouldn't be every time you watch sport. And it's really important to appreciate the level of scourge that it is for young people, young men. Incredibly harmful. And when we talk about the mental health crisis and so many other issues, gambling plays a huge part. Again, in domestic violence, we know the rates of domestic violence go up after every big sporting event because of alcohol consumption and gambling and financial stress. So I think there's a lot of people very unhappy with the Prime Minister around the position on gambling advertising, and we're going to keep making life very hard until they do a much better plan. Locally, with my team, so I'm probably, give me a shout if I'm going over time. We've done a lot of trying to maximise how I hear from everyone in the community, because it is a big electorate now with the North Sydney area. You know, we go from Wollstonecraft and Crow's Nest all the way down to Freshwater and then up around the forest areas. So I've tried to do a number of round tables when issues come up and we're getting a lot of emails on something. We've done a Youth Voices Leadership Forum at Mossman High, Parliamentary Friends of Climate Action, Eating Disorders, Oceans, Sustainable Development in Parliament. We've done a housing round table with state and federal leaders. I've done men's mental health round table, so really important to acknowledge that. I learnt a lot through that of understanding better the impact on men's mental health in construction and tradies. They are 9 times more likely to die of suicide than from a work-related incident, right? And yet you think of the amount of regulation we have around that to keep people safe on work sites, and yet the rate of suicide is incredibly high. And so acknowledging those issues, and they all feed into each other, right? I think I always talk about all boats rise on a rising tide. If we want equality, if we want a healthy society, we need everyone to be healthy. So that was really important. Last year, of course, local issues, there was a fight around Milsons Point Post Office. Again, incredible community mobilisation to change that position. I raised it with the Prime Minister again, since he was a local resident of Milsons Point, and that was pretty helpful. And Australia Post reversed their course. So, sometimes it helps. But that was really important for local residents who really rely on, and seniors and people with disabilities and mobility constraints, where it was really important to have access to those services. In terms of the local issues, the one most pressing now is very much Kelly's Place, which I'm seeing lots of you here still. Now, before coming over, I went over and visited Kelly's Place. I very much appreciate the situation families are finding themselves in and the difficulty. We know childcare is vital for people's participation in the economy and in business. And it is so hard. We know there is a huge shortfall. My understanding from the briefing around Kelly's Place, about 50 families currently using it, but a waiting list of 160. So we know there's a huge shortfall, and we know there's more construction and more density occurring. So whilst I do also appreciate from a town planning point of view that it's important to have open space, especially when the state government requirement to add density. North Sydney Council has a requirement to provide 5,900 more dwellings by 2029, I think it is, 2029, which is a lot in an area that is already highly dense. And so with that brings a challenge of how do we create open space and areas for the community to be outside of their high density dwellings. So finding a balance. I'm not a town planner, and I'm not. So I've written to the council to raise the concerns. I will take what steps I can with. There's no funding federally, so it's not a federal action that I can really raise with the minister. But I will raise it with council again and with the state government around what compromise or what solutions can be found. We can't have a situation where families are left without essential services. Access to childcare is incredibly important, and so I hope we can find some common sense and some whether it's a relocation or a modified version of the development or something that can be resolved that helps deliver both community benefits of open space and childcare availability. It's really important. I guess around all these issues is always the central question of whether or not the decision-making or government is acting in the public interest, the community interest. That continues to be what drives me in terms of getting your feedback and the things I fight for in Parliament. And so whether it's housing, public land, building quality, environmental protection, tax reform, energy resilience, or a fair return from national resources, that keeps on being my focus. Now, I've got the list of all the pre-submitted questions, but Jill wants to probably do it with me. We've got a list of pre-submitted, and we've also got the QR code if anyone wants to put in a question through their phone. Yeah. It's another way of doing.
We have. So shall we kick off and ask a question? I thought I might just give you a chance to have a drink of water if you need one as well. One of the big questions, of course, is local transport and infrastructure and the congestion on Military Road. I know much of this is state, but is there anything that can be done?
Yeah, look, it's very important because ultimately we have got Infrastructure Australia, which has a priority list, because obviously most big infrastructure projects require federal funding and it becomes a partnership with state government. But the federal government won't move on projects unless they are identified for priority from the state government. So pushing the state government to do more about our transport is really important. They have shelved the Beaches Link Tunnel, which would have been good and bad, right? There were environmental concerns, there was exit concerns at Camaray that were incredibly concerning. There was the exhaust stacks, but there was also the congestion of Military Road that is a problem. There is a real push around how can we better maximise connection of the beaches to the metro via potentially Chatswood, because that would divert a lot of traffic through Military Road. More work needs to be done there, and that's also looking at the Warringah Road, Pittwater Road, Office Works intersection, which some of you might be familiar with. But it is also looking at, there is the North Sydney to Northern Bus, there is a New South Wales Government, a Northern Beaches Network review, which I'd encourage everyone to make submissions to. Is it still open? Sorry, I think so. It might still be open. I have liaised a lot with mostly Michael Regan and Jackie Scrooby, who are independent members at state level for Pittwater and McKellar, around their engagement with the government around the transport issues. Obviously, the electorate is very different in its areas. So this area has the benefit of metro, which is fantastic, but there's major parking problems. The rest of the electorate has no metro, and that is really problematic because the buses and the congestion on the road is really significant, and I hear from everyone. Many of my team get stuck on the buses. It's a problem. We've been pushing the government around more buses and freeing up, getting more efficient transport. One of the big hold-ups is actually not enough bus drivers. So ironically, Kelly was down, I have met with the CEO several times. They have been in a bit of a dispute with the Transport Union around bus drivers and pay conditions, which is probably not helping the situation, but they don't have enough drivers to get more buses on the road. So if anyone's looking for that opportunity, please consider it. I have lobbied, I guess, I've conveyed the request to the, ironically, the Immigration Minister around a skilled visa pathway for bus drivers, because other countries do that. I know that might sound crazy, but New Zealand has a special pathway for bus drivers. So where they get a lot of bus drivers in, we don't get them. And it's vital. If we can't get drivers, we can't get buses on the road, and we can't get people out of cars, and we can't get people moving. So sometimes these problems, you have to start thinking a bit outside the box, but at the moment, they're not prepared to move on the visa, the skilled visa pathway, but it's an ongoing problem. I'm highly aware of that.
Okay, I'm going to test your mettle now, because we're going to be dotting around to various questions, and I think one that's come in before from Helen, and also Tim's been asking, is really about AI and data centres. So what can the community do to ensure our energy prices, drinking water and climate goals aren't negatively impacted ahead of the Senate inquiry into data centres?
Yeah, any opportunity to make submissions, please make submissions. It's really concerning. I actually met just last week in Parliament with Di Lee, who's the independent member for Fowler, and she has an Amazon data centre that's already been approved in her area, and another one coming. And really concerned, because at the moment the approval process is local government. So they come in, throw a bit of money around, there's opportunities, it brings money to the area. They get an approval, and there's no regulation. There are no protections in place. The problem around AI and data centres, obviously it's the energy use, the water use. It's also the claimed benefit for the local community or the local economy, and how will that actually translate. But there is the broader question of the data use, right? But on one hand, we do need to have sovereign capacity around data, right? It is really important for Australia to have that. I'm certainly not suggesting that we shouldn't have data centres. We do. But we really need a clear regulatory framework. We need guardrails. And at the moment, we don't have that. And the government is not known for being good at putting guardrails up quickly when it comes to new technology. And they're very focused on attracting the investment at the moment, not protecting the environment, the water, the energy, or the data. So if you think about our public data on the net as a resource, think of it like our gas. Are we just going to let a company come in and scrape all that data off the internet and use it to feed AI models and regenerative models, or are we going to get a return for the Australian people for that data? The same way as we should get a return for our resources like gas. So that's a big question. There's a big campaign at the moment from a lot of our writers, artists, musicians, who are really worried that the government is proposing. So what a lot of the data centres are asking for, and the companies are asking for, is exemptions to the Copyright Act. So that rather than having to negotiate with every individual creative for the right to use their content, they want a kind of an overarching right that the government would grant. And theoretically, being negotiated would be a fund or a revenue model that would come back fairly. I've got my doubts as to how that model will work, and so I'm very focused on making sure that we have the right guardrails in place. There's going to be a lot of focus on AI. I should say, when I had the Youth Ambassadors Forum, young people are really worried, right? People who have gone to university or still studying who just don't know what jobs are still going to be there, what is going to be replaced by AI. Now, many people think of AI as actually, it's a capacity enhancer, right? So it's been described as a third arm. It's like basically it can enhance every worker's capacity, and it can certainly help efficiencies and productivity for small businesses. I'm very keen to have the opportunity to take advantage of the opportunities of AI, but we have to make sure we have the right regulatory settings and guardrails, and at the moment we don't.
Indeed, but Moving on to a different subject, can we not use the current petrol crisis to drive much better support to move EVs rather than subsidising diesel and petrol prices through tax cuts?
Yeah, look, the government did the 3 months excise halving, and that came at a big cost of the budget, but I think it was really important for households and people really, we're at a time where the price volatility was huge. I was critical, though, that this wasn't means tested, so everyone got it. And now I know why government designs it that way. It's easy, it's quick, but it creates huge waste. It means the public purse is subsidising a lot of businesses that claim their fuel use as a tax. An expense from their business. It didn't need to be quite so much. In terms of the transition, well, you've seen a huge increase in EV uptake, right? So we pushed for the government to keep all the current incentives in place around the uptake of EVs, around the fringe benefit tax exemptions and things like that, to ensure that that continues, and we're seeing a huge increase. There's no doubt that if we want energy security, it's how do we use energy that is made in Australia or made from our Australian sun, Australian wind, right? It is a way we can all be the most energy secure. I don't dispute there are certain sectors will still always require fuel to be important, and of course ammonia for agriculture, but we would have much lower fuel uses if we were further along in our electrification of our transport journey. The good news, silver lining to a crisis, is there's huge developments happening. We're already seeing a lot of businesses electrifying their fleets, electrifying their operations. Large-scale transport, so trucks and heavy trucking is really accelerating their electrification. A lot of models are like swap and go, a bit like your gas bottle, where a large truck will go to a certain point, swap their battery, put a new battery in and keep going, so you're not having those delayed questions. The other areas around SAF, which is sustainable aviation fuel. So I've met with areas of the aviation industry around, they're really calling on the government to have a mandate for SAF so that we accelerate investment from airlines into sustainable aviation fuel. So yeah, it is a time, I know, for households incredibly hard, the costs. Especially around non-for-profits and charities. Charities are really hurting. The transport and fuel costs to deliver services for volunteers. It's making things really hard. I was very critical of the government. They did not include in the budget any increase to job seeker, youth allowance, or any funding for non-for-profits in this sector. All of the benefits to deal with cost of living were for taxpayers, essentially. There was nothing for the more vulnerable in our communities, and the rate is just so dismally low. It's just horrendous. So many well below the poverty line. So yeah, a lot more to be done there.
But now for something completely different. What is your position on AUKUS? 368 billion can go a long way to reduce homelessness and poverty in Australia.
It can. And look, the government didn't even blink at budget to announcing an extra 50 billion over 10 years or 4 billion over 4 years. And there wasn't even a discussion in the media about where that was coming from, how we're going to pay for it or anything. I've asked the government for a briefing on just where and how. I support the calls for more inquiry into AUKUS, and that we need to have much better visibility and certainty around what are we going to get for the billions of dollars that are being paid. Under the agreement, there is no guarantee. It is at the mercy of the Prime Minister of the United States to determine whether or not a submarine is available can be spared to be transferred, notwithstanding all the amounts of money. So I worry that we are essentially subsidising US shipbuilding and submarine building capacity rather than increasing our capacity. Of course, there's been a change that rather than getting 2 used and 1 new, we're getting 3 used now. Look, I share your concern. I do, though, want everyone to think about, as an island continent, our maritime security is incredibly important. What we're seeing with the Strait of Hormuz, how exposed trade that comes by ship is to conflict. And so capacity to protect vessels is important. So we do need submarine capacity. We do need a good Navy capacity to defend Australia. We are an island continent. We are incredibly exposed when it comes to oceans. So I strongly accept the briefing. I'm no naval expert, but I accept the briefings I've received around the need for capacity. The question is, for the cost, are we going to get the capacity that we ultimately need in the time we need it by? Because the Collins-class submarines will need to retire by 2038, and my understanding is by 2028, like the 10-year lag time, we must have certainty of what's going to replace them. So I'm concerned that at a very high cost, I'm not quite sure what we're going to get. So, we can't, I don't accept, for example, the Greens Party's position that you can just do away with it. We have to have a strong defence and strong Navy. We have to have, the security of Australia's border and as a continent. It's incredibly important that we have those capacities. But I do accept that we could pay for a lot of things with that many billions of dollars on AUKUS.
Yeah. And I'm just conscious of the time. I'm already 5 minutes over the time I was told that we had to be gone by, or finished by. But I did want to ask More questions? Well, we do have some more, but I'm just conscious that people can also ask you questions at the end before we all usher out the door.
Are they doing it through the system?
It's coming up on my phone. I'm not texting someone. There is obviously a lot of intrigue in the room, and we've had questions before and questions during about the rumours that we could be seeing a move to more of a party structure. Do you want to give some comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think would never consider myself a career politician. This is my third career. Came into politics in 2019, very motivated to represent the community. That will always be the absolute driving force. I am concerned at where we are, Australia, so I am open to the conversation because we have a two major party system that doesn't serve Australia. We're not seeing clear policies evolve. We're not seeing the courage to do it. And the irony is we've had governments that have been tightly, quite tight balanced, 76, 77. And at that point, governments said, couldn't possibly make those changes. We don't have enough political security. We could lose our majority. And then, ironically, we have a government with a supermajority and they still don't have the courage to take the decisions like truth in political reform, advertising or gambling reform and all those things. So it does beg the question, what's it going to take, right? Are the two major parties ever going to have the courage to tackle the kind of things that the Australian communities want to see? So I do worry about now being my 7th year in Parliament, about how do we need to evolve, and what should that look like? I guess as my background as a sports person is you have to keep meeting the field of play. Things don't stay still, things change, and you have to keep evolving to keep having impact and being able to make a difference. So I am open to looking at that question. Now, some of you might be aware from late last term, there were major donation reform laws passed by the government. And again, it was a bit, be cynical. It was Labor and the Coalition trying to stitch up the competition, and pretty much openly in briefings it was put to us that they were okay with the current crossbench, but they didn't want it to grow too much. Right? You can stay, but we don't want too many of you. So the donation reform laws were very much meant to stifle competition and make it harder for more people to be elected. It embeds huge advantage for political parties over independents. The spend at campaign time, an individual can spend up to 800,000. A political party has 90 million to spend across the country. And so any seat where they're really fighting it out, they can outspend an independent 2-3 to 1 really easily. So I think that causes great concern. But since the last election, my concern has probably increased because we have a government with a supermajority, and so the ability to pressure them to move on these key policy areas becomes more difficult. I think a lot of negotiation occurs in the Senate, and so I want to see better representation for New South Wales, for our communities in the Senate. If some of you follow maybe the work David Pocock does in the ACT, I think New South Wales should have a senator fighting for the best interests of New South Wales. And same for all states, right? There's very little accountability on current Senate representation for our state. And then I do look at the rise of One Nation with a high level of concern. And I know from research and briefings I've had that that's coming out of frustration, that the two-party system has not served Australia. People feel like the government and major political parties are just not listening to them, are doing policies and approaches that listen to lobby groups or big interest or big business, but aren't listening to people on the ground for what's needed, and that they're just not moving. So I absolutely appreciate and understand that frustration and concern. My issue, though, is One Nation is good at blaming, it's not good at solving. And One Nation has been in the mix for 30-odd years and has, I would not say, a responsible approach to policies or actually putting forward solutions. And so my concern is, how do we provide more communities with an alternative? How do we provide choice and options to people who are frustrated with the major parties? But there has to be an alternative option to One Nation, because to me that is really dangerous. We've seen in the US what a really divisive, polarised debate can do. And Australia is a successful, multicultural, multi-faith nation. It's too easy to blame others with policies that really don't stack up for problems that the current system has contributed to making, without accounting for, I guess, how you actually solve them. So, for example, the discussion around migration is incredibly damaging. When I meet with chambers of commerce and small businesses are frantically trying to get enough staff to be as productive as they can be. They cannot get enough chefs, for example. And so that is a category of skilled migration that comes in. Now, in agriculture, fruit picking, so many areas, in aged care. Now, aged care in our community, all over Australia, really important. 30% of the workforce in aged care is here, are migrants, are here under visas. And so we talk about the staff shortages in the sector. In regional Australia, cannot get enough people to work in so many care industries. You start doing the kind of things that some on the far right are talking about around immigration, and we have a major problem on our hands. So I just don't think at the moment that debate is really damaging. I'm not for a big Australia. I think migration has to be managed, it has to be sensible, it has to be in line with sensible infrastructure and planning, right? There's no doubt about that. But it is wrong to say that that is a blame for housing crisis or affordability crisis. And the numbers are completely wrong. And what I've been really shocked to see is actually that the coalition under, Susan Lee got ousted very quickly, and now Angus Taylor and the return of Tony Abbott, is this narrative that is incredibly divisive. It is false when it comes to the equivalence of issues and who is to blame for those issues. It is this lurch to the far right, and I think for many sensible communities we're left questioning, well, where do we go, what do we do? So I feel incredibly supported by Warringah, a lot of people writing into me, and I'm very open for it, because I think unless we adapt and evolve, we won't keep meeting the field of play. So I'm very open to those conversations.
Okay, so
it's not easy. But
before we ask Zali to just wrap up for the evening, I think there's one question that I do have to ask, and that is 2028 isn't that far away, so will you definitely be standing as the member for Warringah?
I am very committed to the long haul.
That's a yes.
No. And I guess in terms of I am really committed to the future of Warringah. My husband is here in the room, and he's my absolute rock and makes all this. I think it's really important to acknowledge this is 24/7. You never shut off. You work really long hours. I spend about 18 to 20 weeks in Canberra. it is an impact, it's a commitment, but I think it's an incredible privilege to represent the community, to be in that position to try and help solve these problems. I don't have a magic wand. I don't want to, I always try and manage expectations. I'm committed to look for solutions and to fight for what our community thinks is right. But I think it's really important to have that honest exchange with the community, to manage those expectations but really I'm really focused on the future. How do we solve some of these problems and build a better future for our kids, for Australia, so that we are all safe, that it's fair, that we have those support systems for the most vulnerable, but we also have the opportunities that people want for innovation, for business, for getting ahead. And so they're all the things that keep me up at night, that keep me focused and fighting, and I know keep my team of volunteers and everyone really keen. So I encourage everyone to stay involved, sign up for the newsletter if you don't already, write into us. Yes, I know Jill said our inbox gets full very quickly, but it's how I know what you care about, right? We weekly compile, I'm always told about all the emails, and I say what my response and policy is. I do get help in doing the physical writing of emails because I just don't get enough time to sit at a computer to do it. But we compute and analyse the issues that are being raised, the topics, the positions on things. I then get feedback, I do roundtables, I get information from universities, from academics, from groups, to try and really make it sure that I'm always got an informed position on things. So that feedback is incredibly important. Thank you. Final remarks. I know I'm getting there. This is as bad as Parliament. We always have a clock telling us how long we're allowed to speak for. That's why you'll always see me looking up. And it's very strict. The microphone gets cut off. I've got a bit more leeway here. But final remarks. Look, Warringah and North Sydney at the time when it was still a seat voted over 60% yes during the referendum for constitutional recognition around First Nations Australians. I've continued that engagement. We've had a core group of people very passionate about continuing that representation. And so we are going to be the very first electorate office to launch on Friday a Reflect Reconciliation Action Plan that I've been working with Metro and other leaders around how to do that. It means we're embedding in how we work as an office reconciliation and reflecting and making sure we're moving amendments and doing things that are consistent to advancing. I think it's really important. We've also got a Team Zali Climate Action Group, which is the practical support available for you around your electrification journey. If anyone's been to Neutral Bay to the hub, there's often a lot of information there. But the action group has created a sustainability guide. So this is unique to Warringah. Other electorates don't get it. A sustainability guide and an EV supplement for our community hub in Neutral Bay. And these are to help you navigate the system between local, state and federal and how the different incentives and how to do it, because often the hardest part about electrifying is just knowing where to start, and there are so many people in our community that can help you on that journey. Of course, we also have our long-standing seniors guide, which we keep updating, and I should say I had a meeting with Sam Ray, the Minister for Ageing, raising particular cases where the delay and the wait list is unacceptable, but also concerns around automation of systems and things like that are really concerning. But the Seniors Guide, I think there'll be some at the entrance, really important to help you understand the system. Because of the delay it often takes between approval and payment of plans, aged care plans, really important to get in the system early. If you're caring for an elderly parent or you're approaching that age yourself, it's really good to get yourself in the system, get yourself registered and understand, because it really helps them. And then my team and I, we can help activate or elevate issues when there's an unacceptable delay occurring. And the team is hosting information sessions with experts to help you around, at the moment it's been around the electrification piece, so for your home, including solar and batteries and EVs, for houses and apartments. So I'm really pressing Chris Bowen around that question of how do we help more strata and apartments electrify. There are models, we've got great case studies already. problem is often the strata laws of the majority and the requirements, but for medium-sized stratas, there's great case studies to show you how to do. Now, finally, I want to say a huge thank you to my team. They're here tonight around if you need to talk. They've got name badges on. To Jill for manning the fort at the electorate office while we're in Canberra. But my whole team who give an incredible amount, 110% all the time to support our Warringah community. So I want to give them a huge shout out and thank you. Thank you for coming.